America's first public asylum and its dark legacy. It opened with a promise of hope and healing. This was a revolutionary idea, a place built not to punish, but to care for the most vulnerable members of society. In 1773, when the public hospital for persons of insane and disordered minds opened its doors, it was meant to be a beacon of enlightened thinking. But behind those doors, a very different story was being written. That light of hope faded quickly, giving way to a darkness that would haunt its halls for centuries. A story of brutal treatments, unimaginable suffering, and a legacy that stains the very ground it was built on. This is the story of America's first public asylum and the ghosts it left behind. Section 1. The promise of a new era. To understand just how revolutionary this hospital was, you have to picture the world it was born into. Before the late 18th century in colonial America, there wasn't a formal system for caring for the mentally ill. While some were looked after by their families, others ended up in almshouses or even the basements of general hospitals. But for many, the reality was far worse. Accounts from the time describe people left to wander the countryside or confined in cages, closets, and jail cells, sometimes naked and beaten with rods. But the Age of Enlightenment was dawning, and with it came a radical new idea: that mental illness wasn't a moral failing, but a medical condition that could potentially be cured. In 1766, Virginia's royal governor, Francis Fauquier, gave a powerful speech about a poor, unhappy set of people who are deprived of their senses, insisting that society had a duty to try and restore their lost reason. His argument was persuasive. On June 4, 1770, the Virginia legislature authorized the creation of a hospital built for the sole purpose of treating the mentally ill, the first public, purpose-built institution of its kind in North America. Now, it wasn't the very first place to treat mental illness. Pennsylvania Hospital had opened a ward for such patients back in 1751. But this was different. This was a whole hospital dedicated to the cause. When it finally opened in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1773, it was hailed as the start of a new, more humane era. For the first time, people with disordered minds were supposed to be seen as patients, not prisoners. The goal, they said, was to heal. But the line between healing and control would soon become terrifyingly blurred. Section 2. The cracks begin to show. The hospital's noble goals were almost immediately undermined by its design. The first building was a modest, two-story structure with just 24 rooms. But these weren't really hospital rooms. They were cells. Each one had barred windows, reinforced doors, and held little more than a straw-filled mattress and a chamber pot. From its very architecture, the place felt more like a prison than a place of healing. The philosophy of its founders was also telling. The hospital was created not just to heal the unhappy, but also to protect society from them. Governor Fauquier had spoken of them terrifying the rest of their fellow creatures. Getting committed often involved a legal process, where a court could declare you insane. It was a system built on fear as much as it was on compassion. The so-called treatments reflected the medical understanding of the time, which was, to put it mildly, flawed. Early physicians believed mental instability was caused by an imbalance of the body's fluids that had to be purged. So patients were subjected to brutal procedures like bleeding and purging, where they were lanced or given powerful drugs to violently evacuate their systems. These practices were standard medicine back then, not a cruelty unique to this hospital, but they were often debilitating, leaving patients weak, dehydrated, and even more vulnerable. As the years went by, the hospital grew. eventually becoming known as the Eastern Lunatic Asylum later in the 19th century. By the 1840s, it housed over 125 inmates, a word that tells you everything you need to know about how patients were viewed. Overcrowding became rampant, and with it came neglect. Records show that a single attendant was often responsible for 40 or 50 patients during a 12-hour shift. The dream of enlightened, individual care was crumbling under the weight of too many people and not enough resources, turning a place of supposed healing into a warehouse of human suffering. Section 3. The Dark Legacy Unveiled. The descent from a flawed ideal into a living nightmare was swift. Inside the walls of Eastern State, the word treatment took on a horrifying new meaning. It became synonymous with control, punishment, and, in some cases, outright torture. Physical restraint was the standard of care. Patients were frequently chained to walls or beds with iron shackles. They were forced into restrictive straitjackets for days on end. Perhaps the most infamous device of the era was the Utica crib, a coffin-like wooden box where a patient could be locked away to calm them. While it was popularized in New York, similar brutal restraints were common. Imagine the terror of being confined like that, unable to move, with the sounds of a suffering asylum all around you. In 1799, the hospital even built 2 dungeon-like cells under the first floor for those prone to what they called raving frenzy. Then there were the shock therapies. Patients were plunged into tubs of ice-cold water, a practice known as the bath of surprise, in the belief that the terror of it would jolt them back to sanity. Other cures included applying caustic salves to the skin to create painful blisters, which were thought to draw the illness out. The asylum was essentially a jail where your sentence was indefinite, and your only crime was your state of mind. The dehumanization was total, and this systemic neglect had devastating consequences. No event makes this clearer than what happened on May 6, 1862. During the Civil War, Union forces captured Williamsburg and took control of the hospital. Accounts from the time describe a horrifying scene. They found over 250 patients who had allegedly been locked in their cells and completely abandoned by the fleeing Southern staff, left without food, water, or care. It's a chilling snapshot of just how disposable these human beings were considered. They were society's forgotten, locked away, and left to die. CTA. The history we're uncovering is difficult, but it's crucial. These were real people whose stories were almost lost to time. If you believe it's important to remember these stories and learn from the dark chapters of our past, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten histories to light. Section 4. A glimmer of hope, a lingering shadow. Just when the asylum seemed to be at its darkest, a figure emerged who would try to pull it back toward the light. In 1841, Dr. John Minson Galt II became the hospital's superintendent, and he brought with him a revolutionary philosophy he called moral management. Galt was a man far ahead of his time. He believed that the mentally ill differ from us in degree but not in kind, and were entitled to human dignity. This was a radical departure from the prison-like mentality that had defined the asylum for decades. Under Galt's leadership, the use of chains and other brutal restraints was drastically reduced. In some years, he reported using no restraints at all. He introduced compassionate ideas like talk therapy, therapeutic activities like crafts and gardening, and even a patient library. He believed kindness and occupation could calm the mind more effectively than fear. He even allowed some patients to visit the town of Williamsburg, trying to reintegrate them with the world. Galt also pushed for racial reform. He was an early advocate for admitting non-white patients, and in the 1840s, Eastern State became one of the first hospitals in the country to officially admit enslaved people. However, this progress was deeply complicated. The hospital itself used enslaved labor, some accounts say as many as 45 people, to keep the institution running. It was a glimmer of humanity in a deeply inhumane system, but it was still a product of its time. Dr. Galt's reforms were a brief, shining moment, but they couldn't undo decades of abuse, nor could they fully overcome the prejudices of the era. His methods were often unpopular with the hospital's directors, who fought him at every turn. The asylum's dark legacy was a shadow that even a man as brilliant as John Galt couldn't entirely escape. Section 5. The end of an era and the ghosts of the past. Dr. Galt's vision ultimately ended in tragedy. When the Civil War swept through Williamsburg in 1862 and Union soldiers occupied the hospital, Galt was devastated. Overwhelmed by the chaos and his inability to protect his patients, he died from an overdose of laudanum. While many historians believe it was suicide, the exact circumstances remain complex. His death marked the end of the moral management era, and the hospital soon slid back into its older, darker practices. The institution kept operating, but its location became a problem. In the 1930s, the Rockefeller family began the massive project of restoring colonial Williamsburg, and the asylum was right in the middle of it. The relocation was a complex process tied to state policy and funding from John D. Rockefeller Jr., who helped move the hospital about 3 miles west to its current site. A famous, though likely legendary story claims that when Rockefeller toured the grounds and introduced himself to a patient, the man replied, "Oh, sure, and I'm Napoleon Bonaparte." The original 1773 hospital building met its own fiery end in 1885, burning to the ground. But its foundation remained. In 1985, Colonial Williamsburg reconstructed the building on its original site as a museum, a stark reminder of the horrors of past medical practices. Many believe that the suffering within those walls left a scar on the land itself. According to paranormal lore, the site of the original Eastern State Hospital is one of the most haunted places in America. Visitors and ghost hunters report the sounds of rattling chains, muffled cries from the reconstructed cells, and a feeling of overwhelming sadness. The stories tell of spirits of patients who died in their restraints, and even the ghost of Dr. Galt himself, forever roaming the grounds, searching for the patients he tried so desperately to save. Conclusion. So what is the real legacy of Eastern State Hospital? It's a profound and disturbing paradox. It was founded on the revolutionary promise of treating mental illness as a disease. But in practice, it helped create a system of dehumanization, restraint, and brutal cures that would define mental health care for over a century. It stripped people of their rights, their dignity, and often their lives, all in the name of treatment. Even after patients were released, they faced severe discrimination. In many states, laws that stripped voting rights from people deemed insane remained on the books well into the 20th century. The story of America's first public asylum is a blot on the nation's history of mental health. It's a haunting reminder of what happens when we choose fear over compassion and confinement over care. The ghosts of Eastern State aren't just the spirits said to wander its grounds. They are the memories of the thousands of lives broken by a system that promised a cure, but often delivered a nightmare.